The Senate chamber carried a quiet tension as Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the Republican minority leader, stepped up to the podium. His expression was unreadable as he adjusted his notes and scanned the room. With decades of political experience, his calm, deliberate presence filled the chamber. "My colleagues," McConnell began, his steady voice echoing across the room, "I rise today to address the recent allegations regarding infrastructure funding made by certain members of the House of Representatives." C-SPAN's cameras swept across the chamber, showing the focused faces of senators and a full gallery. Just a day earlier, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas had made bold claims about irregularities in how funds were being distributed under the bipartisan infrastructure law, alleging that McConnell had misrepresented allocations between rural and urban areas. "These allegations are completely unfounded," McConnell continued, his tone firming. "They reflect a basic misunderstanding of the legislation we passed. No funds have been diverted. No commitments have been broken. The distribution formula remains exactly as agreed during negotiations." He looked directly into the camera, his expression unwavering. "Congresswoman Crockett's claims about secret changes to funding allocations are false. The record is transparent, and any suggestion otherwise is political theater at the expense of truth." It was a complete dismissal, calm, confident, and delivered with the authority of a leader who had weathered decades of political battles. To many watching, it seemed like the issue was settled. McConnell's denial carried the full weight of his seniority and reputation, but across the Capitol, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat in her office watching the same speech live on television. On her desk was a stack of documents gathered over months through Freedom of Information Act requests, whistleblower accounts, and internal records. The former civil rights attorney's face showed no reaction as she listened, but her hand rested on a folder, evidence she believed would not only validate her claims, but reveal a deliberate pattern of misinformation surrounding the infrastructure program. "He's so sure of himself," one of her aides said, watching the broadcast. "He has no idea what we have," Crockett replied quietly, closing the folder. "But he's about to find out." Within 24 hours, what had started as a routine policy dispute would erupt into one of the most consequential political confrontations of the session, one that would challenge ideas of transparency, accountability, and who truly benefited from the trillion-dollar infrastructure package both parties had once celebrated as a rare bipartisan success. This wasn't typical partisan noise from Washington. It was about to become a national lesson in political accountability, one that could redefine how the government's largest infrastructure investment in decades was implemented. Before we continue, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insightful political analysis. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our latest deep dives into Washington's defining moments. Mitch McConnell's political legacy was built on discipline and deep knowledge of the Senate's inner workings. At 83, the Kentucky Republican had served since 1985, becoming the longest-serving Senate Republican leader in U.S. history. His reputation was rooted in tactical precision, mastery of Senate rules, and his ability to advance conservative priorities while quietly blocking progressive ones. A political analyst once summarized him well. "McConnell doesn't chase headlines, he chases outcomes. His power lies in procedural control, not publicity." He had expertly steered the complex bipartisan infrastructure negotiations, securing major funding for Kentucky while maintaining his conservative credentials. Publicly, McConnell highlighted the bill's rural investment benefits, especially for America's heartland communities long ignored by federal spending. His messaging struck a careful balance, supportive enough to claim credit for Kentucky's projects, but cautious enough to preserve favor among fiscal conservatives, skeptical of the package's price tag. The approach worked. Local Kentucky outlets praised his ability to deliver results, while national conservative media respected his continued resistance to broader Democratic policies. The infrastructure bill itself had been hailed as proof that, despite deep divisions, bipartisanship could still produce results, funding roads, bridges, broadband, and clean water infrastructure nationwide. Across the Capitol, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett embodied a striking contrast. At 43, the Texas Democrat was only in her second term, but she had already earned a reputation for methodical, evidence-driven oversight. A former civil rights attorney, Crockett favored transparency and documentation over political theatrics. Jasmine doesn't play Washington games, her former law partner told Texas Monthly. She approaches legislation like a legal case, gather evidence, spot contradictions, and back every claim with proof. This approach defined her political style. While others sought headlines, Crockett sought documentation. Her oversight efforts focused on substance, not soundbites, a rarity in modern politics. Her involvement with the infrastructure bill began modestly. While reviewing reports for local Texas projects, she noticed discrepancies between the funding formulas discussed publicly and the actual allocations being released. What began as simple constituent work soon turned into a deeper inquiry as patterns emerged. "We're seeing inconsistencies," she told her team during an early meeting. "The formula described in Congress doesn't match what's being implemented. Urban districts are losing out on funds, and rural regions appear favored. Though even there, much of the money isn't reaching local communities." Over the next several months, Crockett's team worked methodically, filing FOIA requests, interviewing Department of Transportation staff, and comparing public promises with internal directives. What they uncovered would set the stage for a political showdown unlike anything Washington had seen in years. The emerging picture was deeply concerning. There appeared to be a systematic shift in how funds were allocated, one that contradicted the public explanation of the bill but aligned closely with the revisions McConnell was said to have pushed during final negotiations. Revisions that were never fully disclosed to either the Senate or the public. The implications of this issue went far beyond individual political stakes. The bipartisan infrastructure law represented a $1.2 trillion investment in America's future, with significant effects on economic growth, job creation, and essential community services nationwide. If the actual implementation diverged from what Congress had approved and what the public had been told, it raised critical questions about transparency and accountability in government spending, especially for communities still waiting for promised funds. The fallout was both immediate and tangible. Urban centers expecting major funding for public transit upgrades received substantially less than planned, while rural broadband projects lagged behind schedule despite reported funding increases. These weren't minor accounting errors. They had direct consequences on people's lives. For McConnell, the stakes were equally serious, but more personal. His long-standing reputation relied on his command of legislative details and strategic precision. Any evidence that he had misrepresented key aspects of such a landmark bill would undermine the careful image he had built over his career. With retirement rumors circulating and questions lingering about his health after several public incidents, this challenge came at a particularly delicate moment. For Congresswoman Crockett, the risks were high as well. Confronting the Senate Minority Leader, known for his political retaliation, was a bold step for a relatively new member of Congress. If her evidence failed to hold up, or if McConnell successfully refuted her claims, her credibility could suffer lasting harm. But if her assertions proved correct, it would cement her standing as a strong voice for oversight in a climate where public accountability often seemed scarce. As McConnell ended his Senate floor remarks dismissing Crockett's allegations, the stage was set for a defining confrontation, one that would test not only their political skill, but the core principles of legislative integrity in a deeply divided Washington. The issue was no longer just about funding formulas. It was about whether Americans had the right to full transparency in how their tax dollars were spent, and whether powerful officials could be held accountable when their public statements conflicted with reality. 3 hours after McConnell's speech, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood before reporters in the House press gallery. Her expression was calm as cameras flashed. Unlike many partisan press events filled with vague accusations, this one carried a deliberate, methodical tone. A table beside her displayed neatly stacked folders, each labeled and marked with highlighted sections. "This morning, Senator McConnell dismissed my concerns about discrepancies in infrastructure funding as baseless," Crockett began, her tone firm but measured. "I respect the senator's long service to this country, which is why I feel it's necessary to respond not with opinion, but with documentation." She lifted the first folder. This is the official congressional record from November 15th, when Senator McConnell stated on the Senate floor that the infrastructure bill's funding formula for rural broadband would allocate 65% of connectivity funds to underserved rural areas. She placed it on an easel for cameras to capture the highlighted text. And this, she continued, holding up another file, is the Department of Transportation's Internal Implementation Directive dated March 2nd of this year. It shows the actual allocation, 37% for rural connectivity, with the difference redirected to general infrastructure funds, which, according to page 14, paragraph 3, may be distributed at the discretion of state transportation authorities. Her presentation continued systematically, document by document, laying out a timeline that exposed a pattern. Public statements about funding repeatedly contradicted by internal directives, with discrepancies favoring certain states, notably Kentucky. To be clear, Crockett emphasized, I am not alleging corruption or personal gain. What I'm demonstrating with these records is a deliberate misrepresentation of how taxpayer money was to be distributed, a misrepresentation that affects communities across the country who made plans based on those commitments. Her press conference marked a sharp escalation, not through heated rhetoric, but through precise, evidence-based argument. Instead of the usual Washington cycle of claims and counterclaims, Crockett shifted the debate to verifiable documentation, making it far harder to dismiss. Media coverage exploded. Within an hour, major news outlets began fact-checking the documents. Reporters sought comments from McConnell's office and the Department of Transportation. Online, the hashtag #InfrastructureTruth began trending as citizens shared the press conference video and questioned delays in their local projects. McConnell's office released a brief response. Congresswoman Crockett is misinterpreting routine implementation adjustments. The senator stands by his earlier statements. The vague reply, avoiding any reference to the evidence Crockett had presented, only fueled further scrutiny. By evening, the issue deepened when Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was asked about the discrepancies at an unrelated event. His cautious statement drew immediate attention. While I cannot speak to specific internal documents without review, he said, I can confirm that there have been adjustments to funding allocations during implementation, following consultations with congressional leadership, including Senator McConnell's office. This acknowledgement, neither confirming nor denying Crockett's details, lent credibility to her claims and increased pressure on McConnell to respond more thoroughly. That response came the next morning when McConnell appeared on Fox News to address the growing controversy. His tone remained confident, but analysts noticed subtle signs of defensiveness missing from earlier remarks. What Congresswoman Crockett doesn't understand, McConnell stated, is that implementation always involves adjustments to ensure legislation functions properly in the real world. The specific percentages mentioned during debate were aspirational targets, not binding commitments, McConnell stated. The interviewer, sensing an opening, pressed further. But, Senator, some of these documents appear to show changes made before the final vote, changes that were never disclosed to all members of Congress. Wouldn't transparency require informing your colleagues about such modifications? McConnell's reply marked a new escalation. Those documents are being misrepresented by a congresswoman seeking publicity, he said firmly. If she had genuine concerns, the proper course would have been to consult Senate leadership rather than stage press conferences. This effort to shift the issue from substance to procedure signaled that McConnell understood the seriousness of the challenge. By questioning Crockett's motives rather than directly addressing the documented evidence, he had moved from denial to deflection, a shift political observers quickly noted as defensive. The escalation deepened later that afternoon when Crockett responded, not with personal attacks, but with additional evidence. Her office released 3 new documents to major media outlets, a series of emails between McConnell's senior staff and Transportation Department officials. The messages revealed direct requests for changes to funding formulas, followed by internal correspondence confirming those adjustments would not be broadly shared with Congress or included in official summaries. These records directly contradicted McConnell's claim of routine implementation adjustments and implied deliberate concealment of significant alterations to how infrastructure funds would be distributed. Even more damaging, they undercut his effort to portray Crockett's concerns as mere political showmanship, replacing rhetoric with verifiable proof of behind-the-scenes manipulation. By evening, National news outlets were leading with the story, showing side-by-side comparisons of McConnell's statements and the evidence Crockett had presented. What had started as a policy disagreement had now escalated into a direct challenge to McConnell's credibility and the integrity of the infrastructure law's rollout. The situation demanded either a detailed explanation from McConnell addressing the evidence or continued deflection, a choice that could further erode his standing. What had begun as a technical debate about funding formulas had become a high-stakes confrontation over transparency, accountability, and the widening gap between public promises and private actions in Washington. For Congresswoman Crockett, who had relied on documentation rather than political theatrics, the developments validated her methodical strategy. For McConnell, it represented a rare threat to his long-cultivated image as a master of legislative precision. And for the public, it offered a revealing glimpse into how a bipartisan achievement might differ dramatically between its presentation and its actual execution. As Washington awaited the next stage of this unfolding standoff, the question was no longer who would prevail politically, but whether transparency could ultimately overcome obfuscation, an issue with implications far beyond this single dispute. The Senate chamber was unusually full when McConnell approached the podium the following afternoon. Word of his scheduled floor speech had drawn senators from both parties, while the gallery filled with reporters, aides, and spectators following the controversy. As C-SPAN cameras focused on him, McConnell began in his measured tone, "My colleagues, I rise today to address the continuing discussion about infrastructure implementation. While I would have preferred to focus on more urgent matters, I find it necessary to correct the record concerning recent claims made by Congresswoman Crockett. Those expecting another strong dismissal noticed a subtle change, continuing discussion. Rather than baseless allegations, it reflected a recalibrated tone in light of the newly released evidence. The implementation of major legislation always involves adjustments and refinements," McConnell continued. "The infrastructure law is no exception. Certain modifications were made to funding formulas during implementation to address practical realities that became evident after passage." He paused briefly before adding, "While I believe these changes fall within normal administrative discretion, I recognize that greater transparency about them would have been appropriate. The American people deserve clarity on how their tax dollars are being used." This limited acknowledgement, not a full concession but a notable retreat from his earlier stance, caused an immediate stir in the chamber. Senators exchanged glances, aware that McConnell rarely conceded ground unless strategically necessary. Yet, for those expecting this statement to ease the controversy, what followed would confirm why Congresswoman Crockett had earned her reputation for preparation and precision, rather than performance. As Senator McConnell addressed the Senate, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett held her own press conference in the House, this time joined by 3 Republican representatives from rural districts directly affected by the funding shifts. Rather than concentrating on McConnell's alleged misrepresentations, Crockett redirected attention to the real-world consequences facing communities nationwide. "This isn't about scoring political points or discrediting Senator McConnell," she said, standing beside her Republican colleagues. "It's about towns and cities that planned their futures around commitments made when this bill became law." She listed examples. Rural broadband expansions now delayed across Texas, Kentucky, and Iowa. Public transportation projects scaled back in mid-sized cities across the country. Water system upgrades postponed in communities that desperately need them. Gesturing toward her colleagues, she continued, "That's why Congressman Miller, Congresswoman Chen, and Congressman Dawson are here today. Their constituents, like mine, deserve the infrastructure improvements they were promised, not what was convenient for powerful interests to deliver." This unexpected bipartisan coalition, focused on community impact rather than political rivalry, shifted the narrative. What had seemed like a personal dispute between Crockett and McConnell evolved into a larger critique of Washington's business as usual, where the version of legislation that passes often differs from how it's implemented. The Republican representatives each spoke about specific projects in their districts that had been delayed or reduced due to the funding formula changes. Their presence beside Crockett made it impossible to frame the issue as a partisan attack. Their detailed knowledge lent credibility to the broader claims of nationwide impact, Major news outlets split their broadcasts, half covering McConnell's continued Senate remarks defending the overall value of the infrastructure package despite implementation challenges, and half airing the bipartisan press conference where members of both parties described how their districts had been affected by undisclosed funding shifts. The defining moment came when Congressman Miller, a conservative Republican from Iowa, spoke directly about transparency. "I voted for this bill based on specific commitments about how it would help my district. If those commitments were never meant to be honored, I should have known that before casting my vote, and my constituents deserved to know before I told them help was coming." This statement, coming from a Republican, questioning whether he'd been misled by his own leadership, clarified the central issue. Beyond the funding allocations, the controversy now raised a broader question. Do lawmakers fully understand the legislation they approve? And can powerful figures alter those laws after passage without accountability? Back in the Senate, McConnell seemed to sense the shifting momentum as word of the bipartisan press conference spread. His concluding remarks adopted a noticeably more conciliatory tone. "I welcome continued discussions on how we can ensure infrastructure funding reaches the communities that need it most," he said, including revisiting certain implementation decisions if necessary. This shift, from outright dismissal to openness to revision, marked a significant retreat for a leader rarely known to yield. By suggesting changes could be reconsidered, McConnell effectively acknowledged that the implementation might not align with what Congress had approved. By day's end, the triumph of evidence over denial became clear. The Department of Transportation released a statement announcing a comprehensive review of infrastructure allocations to verify consistency with congressional intent, an implicit admission that current practices had deviated from that intent. For Crockett, the victory wasn't about personal or political gain. It was about achieving a tangible policy correction that could restore promised resources to communities across the country. By prioritizing documentation over accusation and collaboration over confrontation, she achieved what few manage in Washington: accountability that produces real change. The image of Crockett standing beside Republican colleagues, each holding infrastructure plans for their districts, became the defining visual of the confrontation. It symbolized something beyond partisanship, a rare moment when officials from both parties united around a simple principle: public commitments must align with private actions, and transparency must transcend political boundaries. Analysts later described Crockett's strategy as tactically brilliant, precisely because it wasn't driven by political theater. By grounding her case in evidence, focusing on community outcomes instead of personal conflict, and allowing space for bipartisan cooperation, she turned a political clash into a lesson in governance. Her success wasn't measured by McConnell's embarrassment, though his reputation as a legislative strategist took a blow, but by the fact that communities nationwide stood to regain long-promised infrastructure investments. In the end, principle had prevailed over power, and transparency over concealment. The aftermath rippled through Washington quickly. Within 48 hours, the Transportation Department announced the creation of a funding alignment task force, including department officials, bipartisan congressional staff, and local representatives. Its mission: to conduct a full review of infrastructure allocations to ensure they matched what Congress had intended. When the law passed, this concrete policy response, rare in a political climate where controversies often fade without consequence, demonstrated the substantive impact of Crockett's evidence-based approach. Rather than becoming another short-lived partisan dispute, this confrontation produced tangible action, with real benefits for communities nationwide. Media coverage soon shifted its focus from the political drama between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Senator Mitch McConnell to the real-world effects of the infrastructure funding discrepancies. Across the nation, local newspapers began examining projects in their own areas, comparing what had been promised to what was actually being delivered, and pressing local officials for explanations. "What we're witnessing is extraordinary," said a senior political journalist on CNN's State of the Union. Usually, Washington controversies feel distant, but now citizens are asking direct questions about specific bridges, broadband networks, and water systems in their own towns. They're connecting national policy to local impact in ways we rarely see. This local engagement gave lasting energy to what might have otherwise been a short-lived Washington story. As mayors and county leaders learned that funds had been redirected or reduced without notice, they too began calling for accountability, cutting across party lines. For McConnell, the fallout was significant and complicated. His early response, dismissing the issue outright and attacking Crockett's motives, hurt his image as a master strategist. Several Republican senators privately expressed frustration at being blindsided by revelations about a bill they had supported. Meanwhile, conservative media outlets that once praised McConnell for securing infrastructure funding for red states began questioning whether those commitments would actually be honored. However, McConnell's later decision to support a review of the funding process allowed him to appear more responsive to valid concerns rather than defensive about past mistakes. By the following week, he was publicly claiming credit for the oversight process, telling Kentucky reporters, "When issues with implementation came to light, I took action to make sure Kentucky communities receive every dollar they were promised." Though Washington insiders saw through the attempt to reshape the story, it helped him avoid serious damage to his leadership position. Still, the episode deepened questions about whether the 83-year-old senator's political instincts were beginning to fade. His institutional influence, however, remained intact. For Crockett, the aftermath marked a very different transformation. Her careful, fact-based strategy proved that thorough oversight could be more effective than loud confrontation. She began to be seen not just as a partisan figure, but as a serious lawmaker focused on accountability and real outcomes. Congresswoman Crockett reminded Washington that you don't need fiery rhetoric to create oversight, noted a senior House Democrat who had initially doubted her approach. When you present solid evidence and connect it to real-world impact, you can achieve meaningful change in ways that partisan attacks never do. Even some conservative commentators agreed. One columnist wrote, "I may not share Crockett's politics, but her approach to oversight, relying on documentation, facts, and focus on real communities is exactly what Congress should be doing." The most important institutional outcome came 3 weeks later when a bipartisan group introduced the legislative Implementation Transparency Act. The bill required quarterly public reports showing how major laws were being carried out, compared to what was promised during passage. It also mandated disclosure of any changes to funding formulas or eligibility, rules made during implementation. This reform, sparked directly by the Crockett-McConnell clash, represented one of the rare moments when political confrontation led to real, institutional change. Several Republican representatives who had stood with Crockett during her press conference co-sponsored the bill, giving it bipartisan legitimacy. As investigations expanded, journalists discovered that similar discrepancies had occurred in past legislation. Analysts began to view the controversy not as an isolated case, but as part of a wider transparency problem within federal implementation. A Brookings Institution report summarized it succinctly. "This isn't about one bill or one senator. It highlights how the gap between legislative intent and implementation reality has become a systemic challenge that weakens democratic accountability." 6 months later, the Transportation Department released its comprehensive review. The findings validated Crockett's claims, revealing major inconsistencies between what Congress had approved and how funds were distributed. Political considerations had influenced technical decisions. The review outlined a detailed plan to realign funding and restore promised resources with clear timelines. For affected communities, this wasn't just symbolic, it was tangible progress. Rural broadband projects in states like Kentucky and New Mexico were restored to full scope. Public transit systems in mid-sized cities regained full funding. Water infrastructure upgrades in underserved areas resumed on schedule. A year after the confrontation, its impact was visible nationwide, not through political wins or losses, but through real infrastructure improvements. The Columbia Dam restoration in Tennessee resumed at full capacity. Western Kentucky's broadband expansion was reinstated to cover all 37 counties. Tucson's public transport hub, once nearly canceled, broke ground with its original design. For political scientists and governance experts, the episode became a case study in effective, evidence-based oversight. Instead of fueling more partisan noise, it led to measurable policy outcomes and greater governmental transparency. As the Harvard Law Review observed, Crockett's model, meticulous documentation, bipartisan outreach, and community-focused oversight illustrates how Congress can restore accountability in an era when oversight too often devolves into political theater for many Americans skeptical of Washington's effectiveness. This case offered rare proof that the system can still function when guided by facts, transparency, and persistence. "It was never really about Crockett versus McConnell," said a longtime Capitol Hill staffer. "It was about whether government delivers what it promises." By keeping the focus there, Crockett achieved what oversight is truly meant to do: improve governance, not just generate headlines. That focus on results over rhetoric, on substance over spectacle, provided a path forward in an era dominated by political performance. Whether others will follow remains uncertain, but the tangible improvements born from this single confrontation proved that results-driven oversight still works. As one Kentucky mayor put it simply, "I don't care about the politics. I care that my community got the clean water system we were promised." If more of Washington worked like this, focused on results instead of credit, people might start trusting government again. And that renewed trust, the sense that accountability can lead to real change, may be the most meaningful legacy of this entire confrontation. Thanks for watching our in-depth analysis of this pivotal exchange between Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. If you found this breakdown insightful, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more political analysis that looks beyond the headlines. Share your thoughts below about other government programs you'd like to see receive this kind of evidence-based scrutiny.